Welcome back into it. It is The Voice of Reason. So great to have you along for the ride as usual. Really happy to have our next guest on the program as we go into our...
Let's go to the Hoosier Media Hotline.
So what it's all about, really happy to have on the program with us here back. It's been a little bit from the American Legislative Exchange Council. We absolutely love chatting with them and everything they're doing around the country. But Jonathan Williams with us here. John, how are you, my friend?
Oh, doing great, Andy. It's great to be back on the show with you. And as always, greetings from the land of make-believe out here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I don't know how you guys survive Washington, D.C. and have to smell the fumes out there. It's a beautiful place, but man, I'm telling you what, with all the hot air that goes on out there, I don't know how you survive every day.
Yeah, you can't drink the tap water. That's the secret.
That's right. That's right. Well, I know you focus a lot, obviously, on a lot of the economic issues, businesses across the nation. And one of the more fascinating pieces that we've been watching lately is the, I guess, reconstruction of the economy based on what businesses are moving from one state to another. Obviously, we've seen over the years of individuals and businesses moving away from states like New York and California and going to more conservative states like Florida, like Texas, and like other places as well. And while we're going into a major presidential race right now, it really does show what priorities the individuals have, because I said this before, John, I think there's no coincidence between when Kamala Harris mentioned that she had enough delegates to be the presumptive nominee, and that same day we saw the stock market drop 1,000 points and everybody start considering what's going to happen here. I don't think that's a coincidence, John, because their economic policy is absolutely insane.
Well, I think what we're seeing, to your point, Andy, is a real balkanization of the states when it comes to, what are the free market, call them red states for lack of some, for easy simplicity there, or we look at the blue states and look at these big government progressive states and their agenda, and where are Americans voting with their feet, as we like to say. And this has been, one of the big premises of our Rich States, Poor States publication now for 17 years running with Art Laffer and Steve Moore is, where do people want to go? They want to go for more freedom. And that's why it's so important that, whoever's in control of this complete fairy tale land in Washington, D.C., understands that the power should reside in the states, and states should be giving us clear signals of what works and what doesn't work. Yeah. And let's hope that we take a message or two from what's working at the state level, and whoever's in the White House can hopefully emulate the policies that are actually working, growing jobs, building a more robust economy for all, and inclusive economy, if you want to use the terms of the left. Guess who's actually winning across the board? It's the red states that value lower taxes and economic freedom are giving upward mobility to everybody across the board.
Yeah, it really is. And it's being proven by businesses wanting to go to these areas. The biggest news that we've seen over the past week or so has been the company of Chevron, where they announced that they're moving away from California and going to the state of Texas, which seems to be kind of a ongoing trend that we've seen for a while, when we saw Elon Musk move Tesla and SpaceX going from California to Texas for their manufacturing. The podcaster Joe Rogan going from California to Texas. We've seen, I live in Kansas here in our flagship. We saw the dairy industry recently on the egg side go from California to Kansas with agriculture and with the dairy industry. We're one of the largest dairy states in the country because of so much of that moving around here. So this is huge of what we're seeing right now. People, the mass exodus coming from the state of California, that should be a telltale sign for the politicians out there that their policies economically are not working.
Well, you would think, but they have every explanation under the sun as to why it can't be their policies that's causing these millions of Americans to flee these high-tax states, including some of these major corporate players that have been in these states for decades, like Chevron, like you mentioned, or Oracle, or, the SpaceX move, as you mentioned. But in Chevron's case, moving from San Ramon, California to Houston, Texas, after decades of being headquartered in California, is a major shoe to drop. It is a major problem for California that you see these kind of companies that bring so much to the communities around them, and the high-paying jobs and just the contributions to the civic life and the fabric of the communities there is something that really can't be replaced. And so this is a major blow for California, yet another one. And it should be pretty straightforward of what is causing this and what has changed in California over the last 20 or 30 years from when it was a real land of opportunity and a state that had been growing every single decade since statehood in 1850 now all of a sudden is staring down the barrel of a reality. By the end of this decade, California could lose up to 5 U.S. House districts because of all the loss of population to the other 49 states if trends continue. And this move by Chevron is just another domino to fall, but it's a big one at that.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. That's where I wanted to go and ask you is what are the repercussions of some of this? Obviously, if the businesses are leaving, that means that the jobs are leaving. That means that we're, number one, going to see immediately, we're going to see the rise in poverty. We're going to see the rise in homelessness. We're going to see the rise in unemployment in the state of California. That's going to put more of a burden on there. But does that by default then see individuals themselves leaving the state of California, looking for work elsewhere? And do we see a consumer side of mass exodus out of the state? And what would that do to something like California?
Well, it's going to be a continuation of this trend, right? And it's going to be a whole lot of, at least initially, high-paying executives or high-paid executives leaving California for Texas to follow the jobs directly. But then, to your question about the indirect effects and the kind of suppliers' jobs and the service industry jobs and all the things that go along with a major corporation being headquartered in a city, you're going to see that effect. You're going to see certainly uptick in poverty, homelessness, crime. All of those issues that will probably then have this vicious cycle of inducing more businesses and individuals to leave. But a couple of the other things, too, is let's not forget Gavin Newsom is governor of California, who was sort of snubbed in Chicago and not given a keynote address this week, had been going across the country, I think probably trying to run for president or some national profile at least. And he was saying California had a $100 billion budget surplus last year, and it might have been true on paper with all the Biden-Harris bucks flowing around state capitals. But what happened this year was it went from a $100 billion surplus to, depending on who you ask, either 30, 40 billion or upwards of maybe 70 billion deficit in California. And one of the reasons why is this outmigration. And so when you see a company like Chevron move, that's going to do just devastating things to the California and local budgets because of the loss of revenue from those companies and their executives. And then the final thing that I always like to mention, and this is one that really doesn't get much attention, but it should, is the charitable contributions, the civic contributions, all those things that maybe fly under the radar, but they're so important to communities and for healthy communities to thrive. And one of the things that we just saw in Chicago, for instance, was Citadel had moved their headquarters from Chicago to Miami recently, and billionaire Ken Griffin was leading that move. And it was just reported in Chicago press that Ken Griffin now has given $300 million to charity in the last year or so since the move. None of that went to Chicago-based charities, and all of it went to Miami-based charities. So when you think about it, it's not just the revenue, it's not just the economic vitality and the jobs, but it's also the charitable giving and what that means for churches and synagogues, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCA. All those things are so key to the health long-term of the community, and that's devastating.
Yeah, that's very devastating. It's the unintended consequences that we see thereafter, the ripple effect of one decision that just affects so many other industries and so many other people. And that's a scary thought. We're talking with Jonathan Williams. He's the chief economist and executive vice president of policy for the American Legislative Exchange Council. I got to pick your brain on this because this has been in the news obviously lately as well that I think could drastically influence these industries. But let's talk about Kamala Harris's proposal apparently on the price gouging and trying to do price control on food and on healthcare industries. Now, I've talked to grocery store owners and managers. In fact, members of my family were grocery store owners throughout the years. They run on very small margins, like 1% profit margins, which is why it's very difficult to run a grocery store. And then when we see obviously the minimum wage price increases for individuals, and then we see the price of the food and the raw materials go up when it comes to their expenses, now we're seeing this where apparently they're going to get regulated even more. What in the world, John, do you think this would do to the food and to the grocery industry as a whole? And how long would it be before we're trying to eat zoo animals because there's nothing left on the shelves?
Well, I mean, this is just yet the latest really excused in a way. I mean, this is a classic definition of blame shifting for these horrible inflationary policies that have come out of the Biden-Harris administration here in Washington, D.C. As you remember the trail of events, it's almost kind of comical looking back at it, the different ways that the blame was shifted from, looking at us and saying you're crazy to say inflation is happening, to then saying it's transitory. You remember that one, and it's going to go away soon. and then continuing down the line of all the different pieces of PR spin that we've gotten from the White House and progressives in Congress, instead of just acknowledging what is actually causing the root issue here, and that is, of course, horribly bloated government, big spending, wasteful spending coming out of Washington, trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see here in Washington, and yet it's a whole lot easier to make a boogeyman out of a business down the street to say they're price gouging you, and instead of responding to these market signals that have been put in place by very bad economic policies here in Washington. But I mean, it would be another one that would be a huge blow to, you look at whether it's mom and pop grocers, whether it's larger grocers. I mean, you're right. I mean, the industry margin is tiny in grocery and in retail in a lot of spaces generally. Yeah. And you look at some proposals like this, and I think you're going to find situations where a lot of these businesses just won't continue. You're going to have more food deserts crop up because businesses aren't going to want to operate in losses. They can't operate in a loss. And then, of course, what will the response of big government be? Will be commit to, either try to subsidize something that they've just forced into failure, or in the case that we're seeing like in Chicago and some other progressive areas that they've had their way for far too long, is government coming in and actually starting grocery stores. We've seen that proposal come up because otherwise the market just isn't there.
Wow. Yeah, talk about a third world country mindset. John, got to take a break. We got one more segment right around the corner. Here, it's The Voice of Reason. Stay here. Yeah, welcome back into it. It is The Voice of Reason. I'm Andy Hooser. One segment left here. We're hanging out with Jonathan Williams, the chief economist and the executive vice president of policy for the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, which you can find online, ALEC, alec.org. John, by the way, there was some news that also came out this week as we were talking about businesses moving from one state to the other of Morton Salts that I've used. I mean, obviously, it's an iconic name. Everybody knows Morton Salts. Moving from Chicago, where the Democrat convention was taking place this week, to right here in the state of Kansas, my home state. Another prime example of big government, big taxes, big policy, big regulation compared to some place like Kansas.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's just, this is a Chevron story in California, but the Illinois version of it, which is now just another major employer in the state of 48th in our rich state, four states metric for economic balance, obviously with some of the and big government policies out there, and been that way for a very long time. A company like Morton's that had been in the Chicagoland area since, the Civil War era, roughly, and moving to Kansas, the state that, while still, as you know, Andy, still work needs to be done in Kansas to improve the business climate. Yeah. It's still light years ahead of where Illinois is. And so I think that's just another one to fall for Illinois, which means more unemployment, all these other consequences of higher budget deficits, and the vicious cycle of big government continues, unfortunately, in Illinois. And you have to ask yourself, when will these elected officials learn the lesson? And that's a really open question, I think, in places like Illinois and California, is how far does this free fall need to go before people wake up and say, this is enough is enough. We can't continue down this path of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
That definition of insanity again. That's right. Funny how that keeps popping up. I love it. Last question for you, John, and I appreciate your time very much. There was also the news that we saw this week in regards to the economy, in regards to job growth. The only argument Democrats have been able to use this entire campaign is that job growth, which has been able to keep a recession at bay, because look at all these jobs that we've created. In fact, they've created 16 million jobs since the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Now, this week we saw the headline that showed that there's a correction in that, and almost 1 million jobs have been taken away from that number, like just over 800,000 overall. But that doesn't matter, right, John? I mean, they still have like 15 million they created for the past 3 years, right?
Well, this is something, unfortunately, I've been talking about now for a number of months, and that there's been this very strong track record of government reports coming in way higher than they actually are. And of course, that gets all the attention and the buzz in the media, and allows elected officials, to your point, to go out and trumpet their policies as the reason for the job growth. And of course, when the corrections come in, they get buried on page 829 of the newspaper, and no outlet covers it outside of ones that really dig into the details. But it's a very concerning downward revision in these job numbers, less than we were told, essentially, on the headline numbers. Getting down into the details a little bit more is even more concerning, because almost all of the private sector categories were revised downward over the last year. The one major category that was revised upward was government jobs.
revised upwards by 1,000, as we saw over 800,000 revised downward on the private sector. And of course, that's been my big complaint with so many of these jobs numbers, is the growth has been in a huge area of government versus the private sector, where we've seen really a mixed record. Same thing when you look at GDP numbers. You peel back the onion a layer or two and realize that because government is included in GDP, that it's been a huge part of the growth of GDP. So you have to really ask yourself, is this top line number telling us something meaningful, or is it more about creating a narrative? And I think, unfortunately, what we found out with those revisions is the narrative was out there, and the narrative was a little bit too rosy.
Yeah, that is a concern, which leads me to one more question for you is when is that teetering point? When's the breaking point between we have too many public sector jobs getting paid by taxpayer dime versus private sector jobs that are actually growing the economy and keeping the country afloat? Where's that teetering point where we have too many on the public dime working for the government compared to in the private sector? Or are we already there? I know our spending, we're already up above 120% at government spending compared to the GDP. So where's that teetering point if we're adding 1,000 jobs on the public sector but getting rid of 800,000 in the private sector?
Well, I mean, I think the point is on the overall balance of public sector versus private sector. I think we're far past where we need to be. The government is far too large as it currently exists, both at the federal, state, and local level. All three of those levels.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. And God bless you guys for working on this, bringing that to light, and working with state legislative governments to try and fix some of this and get us back on the right track, because we have a long ways to go, and hopefully we don't see these policies be implemented at the federal level with a Kamala Harris administration, because we could see the economy really take an interesting turn. John, we're out of time, though, my friend. I always appreciate it very much. Let's get you back on again here real soon, brother.
Well, that sounds great. Take care, my friend.
Absolutely. Got to take a break. Hour number 2 of the Voice of Reason's Weekend Edition coming up right around the corner. Stay right here.